Good morning. Good morning, Lisa. Good morning, Chelsea. How are you guys doing? Excellent. Open your Bibles to 1 Corinthians chapter 11. 1 Corinthians chapter 11. You know, if there's like a glow around my head this morning, it's not the sun reflecting off my bald spot. That's an aura. I mean, it's like I turned around. The sun is just coming through that window. 1 Corinthians 11, we're continuing in our theme on the role of women in ministry. We've looked at the two sections in the scripture that are called limiting passages, 1 Corinthians 14, 1 Timothy 2. I enjoyed looking at those. I hope you did. A little bit different angle we looked at them. I think he's really focusing on family life in 1 Timothy 2. This morning we're going to take up chapter 11, 1 Corinthians 11. This is a chapter about head coverings or veils. And there's a lot been said and written on this. We're going to try to look at it in a broader context and then look at some of the particulars and maybe even some of the history that precipitated this, that was behind it, and see if we can't get a bigger picture of what Paul is doing, because I think what Paul is talking about in this chapter is ministering into a cultural context. And that's what I like about this chapter so much. It really gives us a cultural context to what was going on in Corinth. And anyone who is ever involved in any type of public ministry ministers into a cultural context. That is different than saying ministry is culturally conditioned. The Bible itself is a culturally relevant book, but it's not culturally conditioned. And we need to be really clear about that, because sometimes when you go into some of these chapters and you look at the cultural context, you then begin to think that the Bible is just culturally conditioned, and if there's something in it you don't like or you disagree with, you just say, well, we've grown past that culturally. We're modern people. We're smarter than that. And so you make it culturally conditioned, not just cultural context. And looking at it, you want to look at it in its cultural context and remain true to the principles of the truths that are lived out in that context. That's the challenge. The Bible is a living book. It is a book of faith, of people who live their faith, so that you're not just reading principles, you're being shown how they lived it out. And that's why it's so significant in looking at these chapters, why I personally really enjoy looking at these chapters, because it gives me opportunity to kind of combine a lot of things that I was able to study. Like at seminary, you learn how to do your theology, your Greek language, all the other skills that are involved in what's called exegeting Scripture, which means we get the word exit. You derive out of the text its meaning. But when I went to St. Louis U and I did my work in history, we learned how to do history from below. History from below is different than history from above. It's the difference between the John Wayne movie, The Longest Day, and the Tom Hanks movie, Saving Private Ryan. That's the difference. The Longest Day is history from above. It's the big picture. It's the generals. It's the grand strategy. Saving Private Ryan is history from below. It's how it actually worked out on Omaha Beach. It's trying to get Ryan home to mom, all right? It's about how people live. That's history from below. Historians today do history from below because history from above is boring, and it's all been done. And so history from below, you get into how did people live their faith. And so that's how I was trained to do history. And in looking at this chapter, I'm trying to look at it from below, all right? What was going on in those situations and in that culture that was involved in the writing of this chapter that gives us a little bit of context as to what Paul is trying to say. So before we begin, we're going to start with prayer. Fred, would you open the class with prayer? All right, starting in verse 1, Paul just he's ending a section. Imitate me just as I imitate Christ. I like the way, I think it's the New American Standard says, follow me as I follow Christ. I think that's the principle of discipleship. As you're following Christ, others can follow you. Now in verse 2, he starts now, so he started another section. Now I praise you, brethren, that you remember me in all things. Keep the traditions as I delivered them to you. But I want you to know that the head of every man is Christ, the head of woman is man, and the head of Christ is God. Every man praying or prophesying, having his head covered, dishonors his head. But every woman who prays or prophesies with her head uncovered dishonors her head. For there is one and the same as if her head was shaved. For if a woman is not covered, let her also be shorn. But if it is shameful for a woman to be shorn or shaved, let her be covered. For a man indeed ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God, but woman is the glory of man. For man is not from woman, but woman from man. Nor was man created for the woman, but woman for the man. For this reason, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Nevertheless, neither is man independent of woman, nor woman independent of man in the Lord. But as woman came from man, even so man also came through woman. But all things are from God. Judge among yourselves. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not even nature itself teach you that if a man have long hair, it is a dishonor to him? But if a woman has long hair, it is a glory to her, for her hair is given to her for a covering. But if anyone seems to be contentious, we have no such custom, nor do the churches of God. Now that's clear, don't you think? This chapter has spawned volumes and volumes of writing over what was he talking about. So just kind of stepping back first and taking a look at this chapter, I think Paul, in this thing to minister into a cultural context, is really balancing things together, and he's balancing command and culture, creation and redemption. And so we need to make sure we know what we're talking about in light of command and culture, because if we take a cultural expression and we raise it to the level of a timeless command, then we're going to misunderstand what he's saying. And so he's dealing with commands, he's dealing with culture. He's also relating to creation and redemption, where he talks about man's creation and woman's creation, and then he talks about being in the Lord. So he shifts to redemption. And so he's combining creation, redemption, command, and culture, and he's blending it all together to give a cultural context to ministry. And that's what you have to do. You do it all the time. People do it all the time. The problem the church has had in doing it is we've often created a church culture that does not connect to the outside culture. And Paul is not advocating that. He's addressing something that's going on inside the bigger culture at Corinth and the Roman culture at large. And so we want to be careful that we don't create a church culture that's different than the culture all around us, but that we can build bridges into our culture. But on the other hand, we want to honor the commands. So let's just look first at the idea of commands and culture. Whatever we may think about the particular practice when we start talking about it that Paul is addressing, we want to approach this chapter by understanding tradition and custom. In verse 2, Paul said to them, he commended them, you remember me and you keep the traditions. This gets real confusing for us because we use the word command and truth and doctrine the way the apostles used the word tradition, and we use the word tradition the way Paul used the word custom. So we're not talking the same language, even though we're talking English here. You read an English Bible, and you think you know what the word means because you have a meaning of the word tradition in your mind. One of the things I was taught at SLU was symbiontics, which I think I've mentioned this before. Symbiontics is the study of words as verbal symbols. That's all words are. They're verbal symbols. You fill the audible sound with the meaning in your imagination. That's why we continue to miscommunicate, is because we say something using the same word, but we mean different things. And so the word tradition, we fill with a meaning as something that's just been passed down from person to person, that is a custom, okay? And Paul is commending them for adhering to whatever traditions they have. And so a lot of people think of the church as being traditional versus progressive. That's not what Paul means by tradition. By tradition, he means something that has actually been passed down from the Lord. Okay? It did not originate with them. When we think tradition, we think of something that originates with men. Now, Paul warned about the traditions of men in Colossians, but here he's talking about tradition as having been come from the Lord that is passed down to us. It's a truth because it comes from God. You remember what we talked about last week as authority and source, and how something has authority when its source is heaven? Well, Paul is saying the source is heaven for our tradition. It's not man-made. It's come from above, and we're passing it to you. That's how he uses the term tradition, the Greek word paradosis. Now, jump down in this chapter 2. I want to say it's around verse 23. Jump down to verse 23. In the same chapter, Paul's changed subjects. He's talking about communion now, all right? But in a way, he introduces it in the same way he does the subject on head coverings. Here he says, I received from the Lord that which I have delivered to you. That's what he means by tradition. I have received something from God. I have passed it on to you. And that's why he is commending them in verse 2 for adhering to the traditions. These are the commands that I have received. I've passed them on to you. You follow that? Then after having said that, verse 3, he starts with the word but. Now he's shifting from talking about traditions that have been passed down from God to him to customs. You follow it? The connecting words, I hope you realize how important connecting or disconnecting words are in Paul's writings. He is shifting now. But then he goes all the way through, and you end up in verse 16, and he says, if anyone seems to be contentious, we have no such custom. Other translations say we have no other custom. They argue over such and other. Okay? Only thing I'm saying here is the custom is a mutual habit. It's sun ethnia, sun meaning with. All right? Ethics, sun habit. A habit with, a common custom. We have no other common custom, or this is our common custom. Whatever you may think, from verse 3 to 16, he's dealing with something that has to do with culture. Verse 2, he has ended the section on commands, saying, I commend you for holding to these traditions that have been given. Then when he starts going back to communion, he wants them to know, I'm delivering to you what I've received. We're back to command. You follow? You got to look at Paul. He's tricky, okay? But actually, he's really very deliberate. I'm always amazed at just how self-aware he is of not trying to impose himself. People accuse him of so many things we haven't really read them, but yet he's saying, now we're dealing with something here that has to do with custom. And he'll use the words proper and the word shame. Those are custom words. You judge, is it proper? Or if a woman's not going to have her head covered, then let her be shaved, shamed. And of course, they had the woman caught in adultery, they would cut her hair. Now that may seem like a strange custom or an ancient practice, but truth of the matter is, after World War II, in Holland and I'm sure other places, when the Allies came through and liberated, occupied Europe, the women who fraternized with German soldiers were held up for public shame by having their hair cut off. It is sadly an ancient tradition, custom, to shame women by the shaving of their heads. And that's what Paul's saying here, all right? So you're dealing with something that's cultural, something that has to do with custom. But it matters because we minister into a cultural context. If what we do as a church does not fit into our culture where it can fit, I mean, we're not talking about immoral things, all right? But where you can fit into you're building walls and you're opening yourself to false accusations, all right, and ridicule. And the church has endured a lot of unnecessary ridicule because some of our strange customs. If I'm going to be ridiculed, I want it to be for the cross of Christ and the gospel, not because we dress weird, all right? I want it to be substantive, all right, if I'm going to have to put up with it, all right? And you're dealing with something here, though, with head coverings that's very important in the Roman culture. All right, so remember we talked about commands and customs. You've got those two things operating here. And it's important that when we're reading this, that we're dealing with a cultural expression that has to do with custom, not having to elevate things here to command again. We want to study the word as it's being delivered. The second thing Paul harmonizes and brings together is creation and redemption. In verse 11, another one of his connecting, or in this case again, disconnecting words, nevertheless. Note those words when you're reading Paul. What's he done here? In verse 7, 8, and 9, he's leading up. He says, all right, for man is not from woman, woman from man. Man was created for woman, but woman for man. For this reason, a woman ought to have a symbol of authority. I'm getting this backwards. On her head because of the angels. Nevertheless, so before you start thinking in terms of hierarchy, of subordination, which is how people read that, okay? Paul comes right back to, well, nevertheless, neither is man independent of woman, nor woman independent of man in the Lord. In the Lord is a redemptive phrase that Paul uses throughout his writings when he's describing who we are in Christ. It's a little, it's a poor wording here. I was going to say a little throwaway phrase to us, but it's maybe the most significant phrase, in the Lord. But your mind can read right by it. And he's saying something that's contrasting what he just said. In creation, Adam was formed in Eve from Adam. All right? Nevertheless, in the Lord, neither is man independent of woman, woman independent of man. And then he flips back to balance it even with creation. In verse 12, woman came from man, even so man also comes through woman. If Eve was created from Adam's rib, then all mankind have come from woman since then. So he's talking about an interdependent relationship of mutual dependency, not one of hierarchy, of subordination. That's hard for us to get our heads around because we continue to think of authority in an organizational structure. People think of the church authority in an organizational structure. It's very hard for Christian people to understand the church is organic. Jesus is divine, and authority flows through life, not through an organizational structure with job descriptions. And a husband and wife relationship is an organic, life-giving relationship. It's not a corporation of the Peters family. I am the president of the corporation. Linda's vice president. Okay? But see, people who think in hierarchical terms think that way. Paul doesn't think that way. It's organic. It comes from life. It's rooted in relationship. And it's very hard for us because it's hard to define. Because we always want to reduce it down to, then who has the final say-so? That's how you think organizationally, not organically. Paul's thinking is different than our way of thinking. I think the biblical way of thinking is the family and church is different than corporation or government, okay? And so here this word nevertheless then brings a balance to it. But remember, Paul's very particular with his words. It's also significant what he does not say if you watch him. He will violate, I don't know if there's a rule in grammar. Someone who knows how to write can tell me. But usually when you say two things about one group, you want to say two things about the next group. Kind of like an even parallel. And he says of Adam, man, that he's created in the image and glory of God. And it says a woman, she is the glory of man. But he doesn't say she's the image of man. Because she's created in the image of God too. And so he stops with his analogy. He will only take a parallel so far. And one of the things we have a tendency to do is take parallels further than Paul does. Paul would talk about the husband being the head of the wife. That's a household relationship. We take that analogy and say he's the spiritual head of the wife, which isn't the case. So when you have an analogy, you don't want to take it further than the Scripture takes it. And so man and woman are both created in the image of God. There is a mutual dependency that's being referred to here, but there is also a marriage relationship that he is affirming through creation. All right, and in the marriage relationship, the husband is the head of the wife. Now, modern folks don't like that because they feel that makes women subordinate. And you can try to change the meaning of it, and you can even ignore the scripture if you want, but it's in the Bible, okay? And it's not a question of being traditional, it's a question of following the order of creation. So, look what Paul has done so far. He's commended them for obeying the commands, the traditions. Then he has shifted to dealing with the custom that they're having to address with head covering. But he wants them to know it's also there's an order of creation. So he throws in creation. Adam was formed in Eve. But he doesn't want you to take that too far. Nevertheless, in the Lord, we're mutually dependent. This is really, if you can step back from wondering what is this, and just look at this chapter as a whole, it's brilliant. What he is showing and ministering in a cultural context and balancing command, custom, creation, redemption, and putting it together into a whole picture for us. And he does affirm that the husband's the head of the wife. And the word head is a Greek term, kephale. And some folks want to reduce that to mean the husband has no authority in the household by saying kephale was also a term used for a river as a source, the head of a river. Okay, and the term does mean that as well. But once again, let's go back to authority. Authority is always a question of source. That doesn't really change the meaning at all. It just changes the meaning of those who don't understand authority. All right? And so it's always a question of source. And husbands, if you're not the source of bringing strength and stability and finance and blessing into your household, good luck with exercising authority. You can claim to be head all day long, but if you're just the source of being a pain in the butt, you're advocating your authority. And that's one of the problems, I'd say today, but it's probably been a problem for centuries. We just happen to be living in this century, is that too many women feel like they married a child instead of a man because he won't bring leadership into the home, in the relationship. Okay, and it doesn't mean he has to be rich or any of that sort of stuff. It just means he needs to be a source. So if you're going to have authority, then you're going to have to be the source of something. And if it's positive, you'll have good authority. All right? And so I don't have a problem redefining it as source, but if you understand source is authority. And that's what Paul is saying. He's putting in the order of creation here. So now let's move on. Then in the middle of all of this, there's this really weird verse. Now there may be some that are weird, but there's a really weird one in verse 11. Wait, I got it wrong. Verse 10. For this reason, the woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the angels. Now, I have a New King James Bible, and I think the word symbols in italics. Okay? If now, whenever you see a word in italics in the New King James, that means the translators are telling you they're adding that word in. It's not in the Greek text. Now, I'm not saying it shouldn't be there, but I'm just mentioning it so you know. She has authority on her head. And so they're saying symbol because that's what the veil would have symbolized. That she was a woman with authority on her head. A covering is a term that's very commonly used. And so this was because of the angels. Now that's the part that is extremely weird. All right, is angels. What do angels have to do with this? Well, let me throw you a curveball here. While we're looking at culture, and I want to share something like culture from below that will maybe add something to this chapter. The term angel is from the Greek word angelos, and it can be angels or it can be messenger. We've probably all heard that passage in 2 Corinthians 12 where Paul said he had a messenger from Satan to buffet him. Every English translation translates the Greek word angelos there as messenger. In Revelation chapter 2 and 3, churches of Asia are each sent a letter by Jesus to the angel of the church, the letter's addressed to. A lot of Greek scholars and commentators on Revelation say that's the pastors of the church. They're to be the messengers because the pastor is to be a messenger from the Lord. And so an angel's not going to preach that letter or read that letter to the church. It would have been sent. And so John sent the book of Revelation to these 7 churches, and their pastors read the message to the church. And so angelos there is translated messenger. And so let's look at this verse in a historic light that could be a little different in understanding it. Let's remove the idea of an angel, like we think of angels with wings. I don't know how many had wings, but I mean, they fly around apparently. Angels with wings. Let's do away with that image for a moment. And in verse 10, think messenger. Because of the messengers. Who might these messengers be? Here's the thought that I've come across in looking at these verses historically. In messengers, there might be, are you ready for this term? Gyneconomos. I may be mispronouncing it, but I'm going to act like I know what I'm saying. All right? Gyneconomos, write it down. Make sure you get the spelling exactly right, and you can Google this, and you're going to be amazed how much comes up. Gyneconomos, nomos is the Greek word for law. Gyna or gune is the Greek word for woman. Gyneconomos were officials. They were officials. These guys had a job. They were like policemen. Okay? They had the official title of gyneconomos, and what they did is they were public officials that monitored women's behavior in public. You never heard of these guys, did you? Well, we've been keeping it a secret. I want you to know. They are actually quite well known in ancient history. I'll come back to that one in a minute. There. See that map? You got Athens, Corinth, and Sparta. Those 3 Greek cities. Paul's at Corinth. Corinth was a Roman colony, which means Roman culture dominated Corinth. All right? The gyneconomos, they were recognized by Roman officials from Caesar Augustus to Caesar Severus, which would have been the 3rd century. So they're in Roman law. They're also in Greek law. These are officials. In the town of Athens, the gyneconomos fined the women at a public festival. They used to have these big festival, we have 4th of July celebrations, that sort of thing. They always kind of joined them up with the local deities and worship of Caesar and, public festival days. And the role of the gyneconomos was to decide which young people, I was going to say carried the floats, but I mean, they weren't like floats, but they were like royal symbols and idol statues. Because you had all these royal families that wanted their kids in the procession. Someone had to decide. So they came up with this office called gyneconomos. They selected which boys, which girls were in the parades, carrying what. They also determined how much money could be spent on, I would say costumes, but it was dress. So that some of the wealthier kids and women did not spend more than the others. They actually had exact amounts that you were allowed to spend. And then they also monitored behavior to make sure it was modest. We never think of the Roman Empire being concerned with modesty, I know. Caesar Augustus passed laws against adultery, and he exiled the poet Ovid for writing books about how to seduce women. And so he tried to return Rome to traditional values. I'm not making this up. Okay? And he tried this around 15 BC, and so he had all these Augustine laws that were being enforced throughout the empire by the gyneconomos. They monitored it to make sure the women dressed properly. According to Roman law, married women had to wear a veil. If they didn't wear the veil and they were viewed as adulterous or harlots, according to Roman law, a harlot or a prostitute could not wear the same veil as a married woman, a matron. By law, there were laws specifying what she had to wear, nor could someone convicted of adultery wear the same veil as a matron. That's why Paul said if you're going to go unveiled, you're being identified with prostitution and adultery. Now, we don't think of dress being associated with status anymore. especially in church, it used to be the ministers wore collars, and then they wore suits, and then now they wear a blazer, and now it's open collar. Nobody cares. All right, I may care about it more than anybody else left in this church. Okay, it's just I'm the one who cares. All right. They in Roman culture, you were what you wore, and Roman law specified how women were to dress, and the gyneconomos monitored it. You follow that? Now, in Athens, they fined the women $1,000. In Sparta, the gyneconomos office was so big they had to hire 5 sub-gyneconomos. They were called sou-gyneconomos, if you can pronounce that one. Soon meaning with. And so they had 5 subordinates in Sparta to monitor the women of Sparta. Okay, and they also monitored effeminate men. And you'll notice Paul mentions the men in this chapter as well. And here's how it worked. If you were not wearing the proper veil or behaving properly publicly, the gyneconomos would report you, and they'd write it on a white plaque, and they would tack it to a tree and hold you up to public shame, and you would be fined and have to come before the Roman official. Paul talks about shame in this chapter. You judge whether it's proper. Is it shameful? Roman culture and Greek culture were very concerned with honor and shame. We don't worry about it much more. Okay? So for us to read this, we are so removed from this culture that we think Paul is trying to start some church culture of women covering their heads. And what he's trying to do is tell these folks who are in this culture, look, if you start shedding the cultural norms, which apparently some were, and in about like I mentioned last week, around 60 in the mid-first century, there were women who were starting to shed the veil and walk around in public, and they were being basically mocked as harlots. But most of them were wealthy women, so they were getting away with it. All right? And then it became common for the women in the 60s, not the 1960s, this is 60 AD. It's hard to keep your 60s straight. I know. They had a sexual revolution. They had a sexual revolution of Roman women in the mid-first century. I know it's hard to get your head around this, okay? But they had a sexual revolution, and what they were doing is they were having parties, imagine that, and at the end of the parties, they were having orgies, okay? Now, if you go to 2 Timothy chapter 2, it's quite possible that Paul is actually making a reference to this. Second Timothy chapter 3, verse 6. I think I said verse 2, it's verse 6. He says, of this sort are those who creep into households. So you got things going on in households. Make captive gullible women, loaded down with sins, led away by various lusts. This was becoming a practice, I guess you would call it. And it had to do with young men coming of age at 18, they were to wear the toga. And they had animal house parties, like John Belushi in the movie, whatever it was, and they wore togas. All right? And that was what was happening in Roman culture in the mid-first century. The gyneconomos were the officials trying to curb these misbehaviors, trying to hold to the traditional norms of respect and manner of dress. And so you'll find them, there's all kinds of ancient artifacts from Athens and Sparta. They have not found any artifacts from Corinth of an office of the gyneconomos known there, but Corinth was leveled, and therefore they haven't found much of anything from Corinth. The only one of the major Christian artifacts left they found at Corinth was in the street at Corinth. Someone had carved the name Erastus, chamberlain of the city, and he's mentioned in the book of Acts. He's a Christian brother who was high up official in the town of Corinth, okay? And so that's about all they have found in Corinth. But between Athens and Sparta lies Corinth, and so I think it's a safe assumption that they had gyneconomos in Corinth. Now let's go back for a moment. All right. A Roman historian, or Greek historian, Philochronus, 261 BC, so you're really 3 centuries before Paul wrote Corinthians. Nevertheless, he says the gyneconomos, together with the Areopagites, used to investigate gatherings in houses, at marriages, and other sacrifices. Where did the church meet? In homes. Here's a thought. Go back to verse 11 of 1 Corinthians. I'm sorry, I keep saying 11. It's verse 10, chapter 11. It says, for this reason, a woman ought to have a symbol of authority on her head because of the gyneconomos. Maybe they're going to deliver a message and post it on a white plaque, put it on a tree, and hold the church up to public ridicule and fine our women for praying and prophesying in an unseemly manner, because the big part of their job was to make sure women behaved properly in religious services. Not Christian religious services, just all public displays of religion, of which the Christians were one of them now. And it is quite possible that they are the messengers that Paul's concerned about, and it's going to diminish the testimony of the church in a culture that respected modesty among women. If you want to know about female dress in the Roman Empire, unfortunately, they did not have photography. But in studying history from below, what you study are statues and just anything that gives you an indication of what the culture was like. And here's a picture of 2 sculptures. One's the large and small Herculaneum woman, they're called. And, well, you can tell right away which one of these is married and which one's single. One of them is wearing a veil. I think it's called a stola. And it would come down and wrap around the shoulders, and she would just kind of pull it up over like a shawl. Okay? Roman women, this was their dress of modesty. The other one with the reddish background would have been a single woman. She is not wearing the head covering. But the head covering, because you were what you wore, was a symbol of authority. That's why translators added the word symbol in there. But it was identified. And according to Roman law, she would then be protected in public. If she went out in public with her head uncovered and dressed in any provocative way, Roman law would not protect her if she was attacked. That was their culture. Paul is writing something into a cultural context. Now, I cannot absolutely say the word messenger is referring to the gyneconomos. I think it fits the historical context. Okay? I can say that Paul's dealing with a custom, because he says we have no other custom, that he's dealing with an expression of honor and respect in a culture around them. He's not trying to impose an artificial culture upon the church. See, I think there was a time in culture where women wore head coverings whenever they would go out in public. It might have been just a hat, okay? I remember Jacqueline Kennedy and her pillbox hat, okay? But then there came a point where women just stopped wearing hats or any form of head covering in culture. Now, up to that point, let's just say 1960, whenever you went to church, you would have seen women with a head covering, a hat or a shawl or something, because it was also in the culture. Then the culture shifts, and the church continues it for a number of years, then slowly it just kind of falls off the culture. And then people say, well, we used to do this, and it was biblical, and now we're not doing it. What happened? Well, could it be that the culture changed, and that this was a cultural expression that was legitimate back in Rome? It's equally a cultural expression in different countries even today. And that if you were a Christian worshiping in Saudi Arabia, I would imagine you'd go to church with a head covering on. When Erin taught English in southern France, whenever she walked out she was wearing a head covering. Okay, when you're in a culture where that is a dominant expression, rather than bringing shame or false impression of looseness or lewdness upon yourself, you bring an expression of modesty that fits into the culture. That's what Paul is addressing in Roman culture. I think it's still culturally relevant depending on the culture where you are. So I don't think we throw these chapters out. I think Paul is telling us we minister into a cultural context. That's the principle. Let's fit into that cultural context. Yes. Mhm. There are still cultural norms. We seem to have less and less of them in relationship to gender roles. Okay, and there seems almost like an intentional dissolving of those distinctions. Paul is addressing real clear distinctions, and then he's wanting to tie that in with creation, husband and wife relationship, to say there's still an honoring that's part of the process, and then show equality through redemption. It's an intriguing chapter to me because he's balancing a lot of things. Yes, John. Well, yeah, it's always a question of showing respect and honor. Yeah. And so it has to tie in. Yeah, Lisa. Right. And so the thing you don't do is deify the cultural expression. So you raise it then from a custom into a paradosis, a tradition that comes from the Lord. And that's where you miss the point. Yes, Christian. Yeah, you always want to be aware of the culture in which you're ministering into and that you're sharing your testimony in to be respectful, whether that's a subculture within the larger culture. Okay? Now, Corinth was primarily a Roman culture because it was a Roman colony. Uh, Colonies of Rome, there were two of them that Paul started churches in. One was Philippi, one was Corinth. They were like little Rome. Okay? And it wasn't like they would often have like a little garrison of soldiers, but it wasn't like they ruled it militarily. They ruled it culturally, is what they did. And so they would go out of their way to make sure that the Roman culture and the Roman norms were, became part of the people there. And so you can find a lot of Roman culture in Corinth. All right. And they may have differed somewhat from even other towns around, but it became part of that culture. Anyone else? We got 1 minute left. All right, now go back this week and read 1 Corinthians 11. See if it makes more sense. Okay, you've got to take a bigger picture of this thing and how he's balancing it together.